Ladies and gentlemen, our world is facing a crisis. Millions of people are at risk of starving to death in southern Africa because of crop failures. Now, some, in response to this crisis, have proposed sending genetically modified crops as food to aid these starving people. But at what risk? At what cost? Genetically modified crops are hardly proven to be safe. A prime example of this is the Starlight gene, which is found in genetically modified corn in the United States. Now, this Starlight gene has been found to cause allergic reactions in some people, and it was therefore only allowed by the FDA for use as animal feed. But because of cross-pollination among corn, it has been found in our food supply. In the United States, a developed country which should have technology to prevent such dangers from technology like this. In Africa, the technology that we have to avoid such consequences is not so easily available. Furthermore, any problems that do come about because of the genetically modified or because of changing these genes around would be exacerbated because of the diet of the African people, who eat much more grain than the United States, than people in developed countries such as the United States do. It's a much larger part of their diet. Furthermore, we must think not only of how to feed the people of Africa this year, but next year and the year after that. Growing genetically modified crops requires, for one thing, requires more resources for one thing to buy new seed every year, because many genetically modified crops are hybrids, which cannot produce fertile seed. Or even if they're not hybrids, there are patents on those genes that have been changed so that you have to buy them from the supplier every year. Those resources that are spent on buying new seed could be much better spent improving irrigation technology, for instance, or getting better equipment. Crop yields have increased throughout the 20th century, and most of that was due to improvements in technology and in our understanding of how to most effectively farm the land, and had very little to do with editing genes in our crops. In fact, there is little evidence to suggest that gene editing actually increases the yield of the crops that are edited. It may make certain things easier or more convenient, but it doesn't really improve the yield. And finally, if genetically modified crops were brought to Africa, there would be no going back. Because of cross-pollination, which I mentioned before, those genes would quickly spread throughout the population of the crops, and farmers in Africa would be unable to sell their crops to Europe, which is an important market for them, and it would make it harder for them to support themselves, because the European Union does not accept any crops which have modified genes, as they should, because of their safety concerns. This technology, as I said, is unproven and presents many dangers which Africa would not be able to deal with. And even if it does succeed, most genes are changed to fight pests and weeds, and those pests and weeds develop resistances to the edited genes, and so this requires a constant development to stay ahead of the curve, ahead of natural selection, as it were. And Africa lacks the infrastructure to be able to do that. Furthermore, the weeds and the pests that Africa faces are different than the weeds and the pests that these genes have been created for to deal with in the United States, and so these African countries would be taking on a great risk without as much return as we see even in the United States, where, as I mentioned, it usually doesn't increase the yield, but only makes things more convenient. So, in conclusion, this crisis should be dealt with by sending in conventional crops, which we know are safe, and also by sending in cash payments to make up whatever we are losing, whatever those countries are losing in food aid from genetically modified crops. And those cash payments will help to support the local farmers that have been able to have a harvest this year to help them to be able to plant next year and become more self-sustaining. Uh, so I ask you, ladies and gentlemen, to please uh, consider the people of Africa and consider their future as well, not only this current crisis, and uh, to avoid this danger of gene edited crops, which is completely unnecessary.